Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Medieval Reader. So today I want to talk about printing and the rise of printing in the late 15th century and particularly the 16th century, also known as the Renaissance, when print revolutionized communication in Western Europe. So the book that inspired me to make this video is The Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe by Elizabeth Eisenstein. Now this book is a classic. It's definitely the best introduction to the printing revolution that's out there. This is actually an abridged version of a longer book that Eisenstein wrote, like way longer. And I think that this abridged version is sufficient. I mean, it really raises a lot of interesting perspectives on printing, the effect of printing, not only the effect of printing on religious reform, but also the effect of printing on scientific reform, which is something that I'm going to talk about a bit later, but it was something that really was overlooked at the time when Eisenstein wrote this book. So I want this video not only to be about the printing revolution, but also to think about the revolution in communication that we have today. Social media, what I'm doing right now, isn't that a kind of revolution? Twitter, Facebook. When Eisenstein wrote The Printing Revolution, there was no social media. There was internet, and she kind of mentions that people are starting to have their own personal computers. She published this book initially, you see, in 1983. So in 1983, there were computers. Personal computers were beginning to become a thing. Personal printing, like just being able to print documents. But it was nothing like it is today. And actually, in the introduction, Eisenstein makes his claim that there hasn't been a communications revolution since. So that's interesting, you know, this book is already a bit dated. So I want this video to not only be about printing, but also to think about whether there's any kind of overlap between the printing revolution and the digital revolution, and, you know, kind of open it up to have this conversation about how the medium of communication influences other kinds of revolutions. Okay, so let's start with the obvious. The obvious effect of print and the rise of the printing press is the widespread proliferation of material, of texts, books, pamphlets, illustrations. Any kind of written work could now be mass-produced. You have to understand that before that, there was certainly a kind of a book market. You know, there would be these wealthy people, these nobles, who would patron artists, and their work would be known in a small circle, but a small and powerful circle. You would have authors like Christine de Pizan or Francois Villon. I'm using French examples because I work on France. And these two, Christine de Pizan and Francois Villon, were very successful authors. Christine de Pizan is considered the first woman writer who made her entire career from writing. She was an independent writer who received patronage for her work. And she was quite successful. And she had a marketing tactic where she would have illustrations in her works that would depict her in ways that kind of recall the Virgin Mary, or really draw out her image as a mother, as someone who was defending the French kingdom. She also really just promoted herself through involvement in literary debates. For example, she was involved in a literary debate about the Romance of the Rose. She would do edited collections. So she was doing a lot of the same kind of work you see in the 16th century. And she was successful, but it's not always the kinds of work that people did in the 16th century that was different than in previous centuries. It's that now the effect is different. If Christine had had access to the press, then she would have been able to reach a much wider audience. Her information would have gone everywhere, anywhere where people can read French. When you think about that, you realize that it's not just, people who suddenly are interested in reading the classical sources, as if people weren't interested in the ancients before the 16th century. They were. I mean, the scholastics, who are often contrasted with the humanists, they were often using the same source material, but it wasn't the same thing, because the work the scholastics produced remained within the four walls of the university. It didn't go out. Whereas the work that humanists did was public, and it was very consciously public. A lot of the humanists, like Erasmus, would be there at the print shop, editing, finishing his edits, making sure that his book was being published in the way that he wanted it to be published. Every few years, he would come out with a new edition. And it was these new editions that made sure that these books remained popular. Downside of a manuscript that is handwritten is, of course, that it takes forever to copy it, and then there are scribal errors, and, those are all issues. But at the same time, these manuscripts tended to be made with better quality paper or before parchment, and so they would last longer, especially if they were locked away. But paper is prone to damage, right? I mean, there are people probably have at their house books that they bought when they were a child that is now falling apart just because paper falls apart as it ages. And so the way to keep books in fashion was to keep producing new editions and to keep printing new and more copies. And, there would be some minor changes, sometimes not even. Sometimes they would claim that they have this updated edition, but not very much has changed. You see this even today. I mean, how many of us had to buy a biology textbook that was the latest edition? And really the only difference is that some of the questions in the book are different, but really nothing else has changed. But now, instead of having to pay $50 for the last edition, you now have to pay $300 for the current edition. That's just how printing works, and that is how printing worked in the 16th century. But in the scribal age, there would be writers, of course, there were editors, there were these proto-humanists like Petrarch, and they were doing scholarship, but they didn't have access to as many sources because the sources were all in manuscript form, so they didn't have access to as much knowledge at once. And of course, whatever they produced had a limited audience. So those changed with the rise of print. Okay, now, what is its effect? Now, obviously, I think if you've come watching this video, you probably have some idea about the influence of print on the Protestant Reformation. But if you think about it, Luther's 95 Theses were actually theses proposed for university disputation, which was very normal. Universities would propose theses for public debate. What Luther did not expect, or at least he claims he didn't expect, is that they would be printed and they would become widespread. And this is something that could only happen in the age of print. Okay, so there's that. But then there's also the question of language, right? There's the idea of the vernacular languages. It isn't an accident that the rise of nationalism occurred at the same time as the Protestant Reformation and at the same time as printing became the revolution that it became. So yes, Luther's Bible is now available to people who speak German, but Calvin cannot read it, right? And so Calvin, or Olivetan, who translated the Bible into French for the Reformed Church in Geneva, his Bible is in French, but those aren't going to be read by Luther, right? So you see how translation makes books available for a wider audience, but at the same time, because the vernacular languages are replacing Latin, which up until then was the universal European language of intellectuals, as these vernacular languages are replacing, Latin, you're starting to see a breakup of Europe. Then another thing about printing, and this is where we can start to draw the parallels between the printing revolution and the digital revolution, is that people can be partisans without being in the same locale. So you can have people across a nation that are suddenly Lutherans, or even before Luther, just suddenly interested in Erasmian humanism. They might be students, say at the University of Paris, they're not liking the curriculum there, and they are suddenly having access to this humanistic material that's being published, and they are now supporters. Maybe they too will publish material to show their support. Of course, we see this with social media. We see this here, where I'm able to create this conversation with you all, no matter where we are. Of course, it's even more, I think, directed really bridges the gap even more in the digital revolution. I want to read you one quote, which I think really sums this up really well. Shortly before Copernicus was born, however, an actual revolution in book production had begun to affect the technical literature and mathematical tools available to astronomers. As a student at Krakow in the 1480s, the young Copernicus probably found it hard to get a look at a single copy of Ptolemy's Almagest, even in a corrupted medieval Latin form. Before he died, he had 3 different editions at hand. As a 14-year-old in Copenhagen in 1560, the young Tycho Brahe could purchase all of Ptolemy's work, including an improved translation of the full Almagest, made from the Greek. Soon thereafter, while at Leipzig and still in his teens, Tycho picked up a copy of the Prutenic tables that had recently been computed on the basis of Copernicus's major work. No new sort of observation had affected astronomy in this interval. Nevertheless, the transmission of old observations had undergone a major change. One need not wait until half a century after Copernicus's death to observe the effect of this change, for it had begun to affect the study of astronomy shortly before Copernicus was born. Copernicus was not supplied, as Tycho's successors would be, with precisely recorded fresh data, but he was supplied, as Regiomontanus's successor and Aldus Manutius's contemporary, with guidance to technical literature carefully culled from the best Renaissance Greek manuscript collections, and, for the first time, made available outside library walls. Eisenstein makes the point that Tycho Brahe didn't actually do observations himself. He just had access to a ton of material that Copernicus didn't. And when you think about it, I mean, when you talk about scientists working directly with what they see, that's true, but they're also working with past scholarship. I mean, what you get with the rise of print is the rise of scholarship as we know it. I think about myself, the fact that I can have access to thousands of digitized manuscripts. That's incredible. I made a whole video about it. It's an incredible development. It makes you also think about how the way that material is made available can be just as, or maybe even more important than what material is being communicated. I really do recommend this book. There's a lot that I could say about this, and I hope to speak more about printing and the printing revolution in the future. But let me know if any of this rings true to you, especially as you are very much involved in social media. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.